The rain arrived without warning, hammering the rutted main street of Broken Wheel into a river of mud and refuse. Chaza stood at the edge of town water, streaming from the brim of his flat-crowned hat, soaking through the shoulders of his wool shirt until the fabric clung to his skin like a second hide. His moccasins, worn thin from 4 days of walking across open prairie, were caked in clay that pulled at every step. The blister on his right heel had burst that morning, leaving a raw patch that burned with each movement. Worse was the old wound in his hip, a puckered scar, where a vigilante's bullet had torn through muscle and lodged against bone last winter. The cold and damp made it throb a deep ache that radiated down his thigh and into his knee. He needed a horse. Without one, he could not return to his band at Ghost Creek before the first snow sealed the mountain passes. His people would survive without him, they always had. But he had given his word to return before the frost moon. A promise in his world was a knot tied in rawhide, unbreakable, permanent, sacred. The livery barn sat at the far end of town, a squat structure with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read, "Hale's Horses and Trade," in faded lettering. Smoke drifted from the blacksmith's forge next door, mixing with the rain, to create a gray haze that smelled of wet iron and burning coal. Chaza pulled his collar higher and walked toward it, ignoring the stares from the men huddled under the saloon awning. Their eyes followed him hard, suspicious eyes, that saw only his dark skin, his long hair braided with leather cord, the beaded band around his hat. In towns like this, a Lakota man was either invisible or a target. Chaza had learned long ago to walk the line between both, to move through white settlements like smoke through trees present but untouchable. Inside the barn, the noise of the storm dulled to a muffled roar against the plank roof. The air was thick with the smell of hay manure, saddle oil, and something else, something sour and wrong like meat, left too long in the sun, or the stench of fear allowed to fester in a closed space. Chaza's instincts prickled. He had smelled fear before in wounded animals and cornered men. This was different. This was fear mixed with despair and something darker still. Vernon Hale stood near the center aisle, leaning against a support post, with his arms crossed over his chest. He was a lean man in his 60s, with gray hair slicked back with pomade and a waistcoat that might once have been fine, but now bore sweat stains under the arms and a frayed hem that spoke of better days, long past. His eyes were pale blue, sharp as broken glass, and they assessed Chaza with the calculating gaze of a man who weighed everything in terms of profit and loss. When he saw Chaza, his mouth twisted into a smile that did not reach those cold eyes. "Need a horse?" Chaza said, his voice low and even. He spoke English, well learned from traders and missionaries over years of careful listening, though he kept his sentences short and direct. Words were tools, not weapons, and he used them with the same economy he applied to everything else in his life. Hale straightened slowly, his gaze traveling from the beaded hatband down to the knife sheathed at Chaza's belt, a good blade, well maintained, the handle wrapped in leather, worn smooth from years of use. "Got a few." Hale said, his tone slick and practiced. "Depends what you can pay. Indians usually come in here with pelts or beadwork, trying to trade junk for good horse flesh." Chaza reached into the leather pouch at his side and drew out 3 silver dollars. They were real coins, heavy and clean-earned from a hide trade the previous autumn with an honest trader at Fort Laramie. He held them in his palm, letting Hale see them clearly in the dim light, filtering through gaps in the plank walls. Hale's eyes flicked to the coins, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, followed by a calculating gleam. Then, oddly, he smiled wider and opened his own hand to reveal a fistful of silver, at least a dozen pieces, all of them gleaming, as if freshly minted. "Got plenty of coin myself these days," he said, his tone almost boastful. "Business is good, real good. Better than it's ever been if you want the truth of it." Chaza's eyes narrowed slightly. Too many coins for a livery stable in a town this size. Even the best stables in Cheyenne did not generate that kind of regular income. Hale saw his look and laughed a thin sound with no humor in it. "Sheriff's got enterprises all over this county. I'm just one piece of a larger operation, you might say." A horse nickered somewhere in the back of the barn, a nervous sound. Chaza's gaze moved past Hale down the row of stalls. The sound of hooves shifting uneasily in straw. Then something else, a breath quick and shallow, unmistakably human and afraid. The hair on the back of Chaza's neck rose. Hale's smile thinned to a hard line. He stepped sideways, deliberately blocking the aisle with his body. "You got your pick of 3 mares in the front stalls. Good stock, all of them. I'll show you." Chaza walked past him without asking permission. "Hey now," Hale said, his voice hardening like cooling iron. "I didn't say you could wander back there. Those stalls are private business." Chaza moved down the aisle with the silent tread of a hunter, his boots making no sound on the packed dirt floor. The horses turned their heads, eyes rolling white in the dim light, sensing the tension building in the air. The sound came again. Not a horse. Softer, more fragile. A gasp cut short, as if someone had clapped a hand over their own mouth to stifle it. He stopped at the last stall on the left. The gate hung half open and the wood splintered at the latch where it had been forced closed too many times. Inside, no horse. Just a heap of straw, a broken wooden bucket lying on its side, and a woman huddled against the far post like a discarded piece of refuse. She was chained. An iron manacle circled her left wrist, the metal dark with rust and crusted with dried blood. A thick chain, the kind used for logging operations or hauling loaded wagons up steep grades, ran from the manacle to a ring bolted deep into the post. She sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, her right arm wrapped around them, her head bowed so that her hair fell forward in a curtain. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, the fabric stiff with dried blood that had soaked through and darkened to the color of old rust. Her cheek was swollen, the skin a mottled purple and yellow that spoke of repeated blows split at the corner of her mouth, where someone had backhanded her hard enough to tear the flesh. Her hair, once blonde, was matted with straw, and dirt hanging in tangled clumps that obscured most of her face. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were blue, a pale, washed-out blue like winter sky. And they held no hope, only a dull resignation that made something twist hard in Chaza's chest. His hand moved instinctively to the knife at his belt, fingers curling around the worn leather grip. Then he forced himself to stop, to breathe slowly, to let the hot rush of anger drain away before it made him do something foolish. Anger would not help her now. Anger would only get them both killed. He turned slowly, deliberately, giving Hale time to see the look on his face. Hale had followed him and now stood just outside the stall gate, one hand resting on the latch, with deceptive casualness. But his body was tense, coiled, ready to bolt or fight, depending on which way the wind blew. "That's private property," he said, his voice clipped and careful. "She owes money to the sheriff. Got herself into a contract she couldn't keep. Sheriff Malloy is handling the matter personally. It's all legal and proper." "She's bleeding," Chaza said, keeping his voice flat and empty of the rage building inside him. "She's difficult," Hale replied with a shrug, as if discussing a stubborn mule. He glanced at the woman, and for a moment, something like disgust flickered across his weathered face. Damaged goods now, truth be told. But that's between her and the man who bought her ticket. Sheriff will sort it out when he's ready. Probably send her to one of the mining camps up north where they're not so particular. The woman made a sound, a broken sob, that she tried desperately to muffle against her knees. Her whole body shook with the effort of staying silent. Chaza took a step toward her, moving slowly and carefully, as he would approach a wounded deer. She flinched violently, pressing herself back against the post, as if she could merge with the wood and disappear entirely. The chain rattled a sound that made Chaska's teeth clench. He stopped immediately, his hands open at his sides, palms up where she could see them clearly. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly, his voice pitched low and steady the way he might speak to a frightened animal caught in a trap. She searched his face with those pale blue eyes, looking for the lie, for the trick, for the moment when he would reveal himself to be just another predator. Her lips trembled. Her breathing was fast and shallow on the knife edge of panic. "They said—" Her voice cracked raw from crying or screaming or both. "They said if I didn't sign the papers, they'd—" She could not finish the sentence. She covered her face with her free hand, the manacled wrist jerking uselessly against the chain. "Quiet." Hale snapped, his voice sharp as a whip crack. He stepped into the stall, his boots squelching in the wet straw. "You don't talk to him. You don't talk to anyone unless the sheriff says so. That was made clear to you." Chaza moved between them, not fast, but deliberate, his body becoming a solid wall between Hale and the woman. He was not a large man by white standards, but he was solid, compact, built like someone who had spent his life doing hard work and harder fighting. "Unshackle her," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a command despite its quietness. Hale laughed, a short, bitter sound like a dog's bark. "You got no authority here, Injun. This is a white man's town, white man's law. You want trouble, I'll fetch the sheriff right now and he'll string you up for interfering with legal business. How'd you like that?" Chaza looked down at the $3 silver still clutched in his left hand. He had carried them for months, keeping them safe and dry, planning carefully for this moment, when he would trade honest money for honest horseflesh. Now he closed his fist around them, feeling the weight and coldness of the metal. Then he reached out and placed them one by one into Hale's palm with deliberate slowness. "Take your coins." Chaza said, his voice calm but carrying iron beneath it like a blade wrapped in silk. "I'm not leaving her in here like this. That's not negotiable." Hale's face darkened red, creeping up his neck from his collar. He opened his mouth to reply, probably to threaten or bluster or call for help. The barn doors slammed open with a crash that made the horses whinny and stamp in alarm. Rain gusted in along with 3 men on horseback, their animals blowing and snorting. The lead rider dismounted in one smooth, practiced motion that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle, his spurs jangling like rattlesnake tails against the dirt floor. He wore a deputy's badge pinned to his leather vest, and his face was all hard angles and old scars, a broken nose that had healed crooked, a knife slash across his left eyebrow, that had left the skin puckered and white, and eyes that held the flat, empty look of a man who had killed often and would kill again without losing a moment of sleep over it. Blackjack Crow, former bounty hunter, current deputy, and a man with a reputation for cruelty that extended from the Dakota Territory clear down to the Texas Panhandle. "Well, well," Crow said, his voice a lazy drawl that somehow made the words more menacing. He shook water from his hat and grinned, showing yellowed teeth with one incisor missing on the left side. "Didn't expect to find an Indian in here, Vernon. Thought you only dealt in horses and whores these days. Didn't know you'd started taking in stray dogs, too." The 2 men behind him laughed on cue, a sound as ugly as their faces. One held a coiled chain in his thick hands. The other rested his hand on the butt of his revolver, thumb hooked over the hammer, in a casual threat that was anything but casual. Chaza did not move. He stood between Hale and the woman, his posture relaxed, but ready balanced on the balls of his feet. He had fought men like Crow before in other towns and other lifetimes. Men who enjoyed cruelty, who saw weakness and pressed until something broke just for the pleasure of hearing it snap. Crow walked closer, his boots squelching in the wet straw, each step measured and deliberate. He glanced past Chaza into the stall taking in the woman's huddled form with a look of cold amusement. Then his gaze returned to Chaza, traveling up and down as if assessing livestock. His grin widened. "You buying a horse?" he asked, drawing out the words. "Or buying trouble because we got plenty of the second kind available if that's what you're after?" "Only a horse," Chaza said, his voice flat and empty of challenge. "Then why you standing over her, like some kind of guardian angel?" Crow tilted his head, the grin never wavering. "You got feelings for white women, Injun? That the problem here, she needs help," Chaza said simply. Crow's smile turned cold and sharp as a knife blade. "She needs to learn her place is what she needs. And so do you, for that matter." He swung the chain in his hand in a lazy arc, the links clinking rhythmically, a casual display of potential violence. "Now step back nice and easy before I drag you out of here by your neck and teach you some manners." Thunder cracked overhead so loud it shook the barn timbers and made dust sift down from the rafters. In that instant, while everyone's attention flickered upward for just a heartbeat, Chaza's hand shot out. He grabbed a blacksmith's hammer, hanging from a peg on the post, heavy iron, 2 pounds of forged steel, the handle worn smooth from years of use, and swung it down hard twice in rapid succession against the bracket holding the woman's chain. Sparks flew, the metal shrieked. The pin holding the bracket together popped free with a sound like a gunshot. The chain fell clattering against the wooden floor planks. The woman gasped, her eyes going wide with shock, and something that might have been hope flickering to life in their depths. Crow raised his revolver, a long-barreled Colt that looked well-maintained and well-used. Chaza hurled the 50-pound sack of oats that had been leaning against the stall corner. It struck Crow square in the chest, with enough force to knock him backward into the mud outside the barn. His gun fired wild, the bullet punching a hole in the roof and letting in a shaft of gray light. Chaza snatched Hale's Spencer rifle from where it leaned against the wall. He had noted it earlier, seen that the magazine tube was empty, but it would serve as a bluff if nothing else. He levered the action with a loud metallic clack that echoed in the sudden silence. "Don't," he said quietly, the rifle pointed at Crow's men. The deputies hesitated, hands frozen on their weapons, calculating odds and not liking what they saw. Crow scrambled to his feet with a curse that would have blistered paint mud dripping from his coat and hat, his face twisted with humiliation and rage. His hand moved toward his gun. Chaza was already moving. He backed toward the rear door of the barn, one arm looped around the woman's waist as she struggled to her feet on legs that barely supported her weight. Her ankle buckled, the joint swollen and possibly broken. He caught her before she fell, taking her full weight. "Run," he said. They burst out into the rain through the back door. Shots cracked behind them, wild and poorly aimed in the confusion and downpour. Chaza pulled the woman into the narrow alley between the feed store and the barber's shop, their boots sliding in ankle-deep mud. She whimpered with each step, clutching his arm with desperate strength. The chain still attached to her wrist dragged in the dirt behind them, clinking with every lurching movement. Behind them, Crow's voice rose above the storm, high and tight with fury. "Find them $50 to the man who brings me that Indian's scalp, and another 50 if you bring the woman back alive." Chaza turned a corner, then another, weaving through the back alleys of Broken Wheel with the instinct of a hunted animal. The woman's breathing was ragged and fever-hot against his shoulder. He could feel her body trembling violently, whether from cold or shock or terror he could not tell. Probably all three. He needed to get that chain off her before it snagged on something. And he needed to get them both out of this town before Crow organized a proper pursuit. They had maybe 20 minutes. Maybe less if Crow was as good a tracker as his reputation claimed. Chaza had not always walked alone through hostile country. Once, not so long ago, in the measure of seasons, he had ridden with his band through the open grasslands west of the Black Hills, following the great buffalo herds that moved like rivers of living flesh across the prairie. His father had been a skilled hunter, a man who could track a deer through rock and read weather in the taste of the wind. His mother had been a healer who knew every plant that grew in the valleys and high meadows, who could brew medicines that fought fever and poultices that drew poison from wounds. They had taught him to fight when fighting was necessary, to speak English when it mattered for trade, and to keep his word like rawhide tied in a proper knot, tight, strong, and unbreakable even under strain. But that was before the vigilantes came, in the dead of winter. 6 men on horseback, white ranchers from the settlements around Prairie Dawn, armed with rifles and fortified with whiskey courage. They had caught him alone on the trail, where it wound through a narrow defile between rock walls. They accused him of stealing a calf from a rancher named Dodd, a lie, a convenient excuse for violence, but one they clearly believed or pretended to believe. Chaza had tried to explain calmly, to show them the pelts he carried as proof he had no need to steal scrawny cattle. They did not listen. They never did when their minds were already made up and their blood was hot. They shot his bay mare out from under him without warning. The bullet meant for his back struck the horse's flank instead, and she went down screaming in a way that still haunted his dreams. Chaza rolled clear of her thrashing hooves, but not fast enough. A second shot tore through his left hip, the bullet shattering bone before lodging deep in muscle. The pain was immediate and absolute, whiting out his vision for several heartbeats. He crawled into a dry creek bed while they reloaded, dragging himself over rocks that tore open his hands and knees. He wedged himself under an overhang where the winter runoff had carved out a hollow in the bank, and he waited there for 3 days while they searched. He lived on handfuls of snow and the strips of dried meat in his pouch, drifting in and out of consciousness, listening to them call to each other as they quartered the area like hounds after a fox. On the 3rd day, they gave up and rode away, probably assuming he had crawled off somewhere to die like a wounded animal. It took him another week to make it back to where his band had been camped. By then they had moved on, following the herds north to the winter grazing grounds, as they always did when the first serious snows threatened. He had been too weak from blood loss and infection to follow his wound festering, despite his attempts to clean it with melted snow and strips torn from his shirt. An old trapper named Two Crows, a half-breed who lived in the margins between white and Indian worlds, found him half dead in a snowdrift and dragged him to a trading post. The post doctor, a man who smelled perpetually of rye whiskey and tobacco and defeat, had dug the bullet out with a knife heated red in a forge, then cauterized the wound with a branding iron, while 2 men held Chaza down. He survived, but the wound left a jagged scar that ached whenever the weather turned cold or wet, a constant reminder of how close he had come to dying alone in the snow. It had taken 4 months for him to heal enough to walk without a pronounced limp. By then spring had come, and his band had moved too far north to follow on foot. So he had walked trading work for food at isolated ranches, whose owners did not care about the color of his skin as long as he could mend fences and break horses. 4 days ago, he had started the walk from Prairie Dawn to Broken Wheel, the blistered heel on his right foot now a constant source of pain. He had $3 silver, all that remained of his winter's work, and he had planned to use them for a strong horse to carry him the 80 miles to Ghost Creek before the first snow. He had not planned to find a woman chained in a stall like an animal. He had not planned to throw away his money and his safety for a stranger. But some things could not be walked away from. Some things once seen demanded action, regardless of cost. Now they crouched behind a stack of empty crates in the alley behind the dry goods store, rain hammering the tin roof above them in a deafening staccato. The woman's teeth chattered so hard he could hear them clicking together. Her wrist, where the manacle still circled, was raw and weeping, the skin rubbed away down to bleeding flesh. The chain dragged in the mud between them, 3 feet of rusted iron links that would make it almost impossible to move quietly or quickly. "What's your name?" Chaza asked, keeping his voice low. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes struggling to focus. Her pupils were different sizes. He noticed a sign of concussion. Miriam. She finally whispered the word barely audible over the rain. Miriam Cole. Where are you from? Pennsylvania, Lancaster County. Her voice was stronger now, though it still shook. I came on the stagecoach 3 weeks ago. They said there was work here in the territories. A man who wanted to marry, who needed a wife to help run his ranch. They showed me a letter, a photograph of a respectable-looking man standing in front of a house. It all seemed legitimate. But it wasn't. Chaza said, already knowing the answer. No. She swallowed hard, her throat working. When I arrived, the man from the photograph wasn't there. Instead, there was Sheriff Malloy and his deputy. They were very polite at first, apologetic. They said there had been a misunderstanding, that the man had been called away on business but would return in a few days. They offered to put me up at the boarding house until he came back. Her hands twisted together in her lap. That first night they came to my room, took my papers, my tickets, the little money I had left. When I tried to leave the next morning, they locked me in. And then, her voice broke completely. She covered her face with her free hand, shoulders shaking. Then they brought me to the barn. Hale chained me up and said I belonged to the sheriff now. That I'd signed papers agreeing to marry him, though I never signed anything. They made me practice writing lines and lines of my name and phrases like, I consent and I agree. I thought it was just to keep me occupied. I didn't realize they were going to use those practice sheets to forge documents. Chaza felt his hands curl into fists. He forced them to relax, to unclench. Anger would not help. We need to get that chain off you, he said. There's a doctor in this town, Irish, name's Byrne. He lives 2 blocks east of here. He won't help, Miriam said, her voice flat and dead. No one helps. Malloy owns this town. He owns the bank. He controls the telegraph office. He decides who gets shipments and who doesn't. Everyone's either in his pocket or too afraid to cross him. She looked at Chaza with those pale blue eyes. Why are you helping me? You don't know me. I'm nothing to you. Because no one should be chained, Chaza said simply. And because I can. She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something, maybe sincerity, maybe hidden motives, maybe just trying to understand why a Lakota warrior would risk his life for a white woman he had never met. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy something in her, because she nodded slowly. We try the doctor, she said. But if he won't help, we run. We get as far from this town as we can. Agreed, Chaza said. He pulled the neckerchief from around his neck clean. Despite the mud and rain, he had washed it in a creek that very morning and draped it over her torn shoulder, where blood still seeped slowly through the fabric of her dress. His fingers brushed her skin, and she flinched reflexively. But then she went still, holding herself very carefully, and met his eyes. For a moment the rain seemed distant and the world narrowing to just the 2 of them in this small space behind the crates. Something passed between them in that look, something wordless and profound, an understanding perhaps, or the first fragile thread of trust being spun between 2 people who had every reason not to trust anyone. Come on, Chaza said quietly. Stay close. They moved through the alleys like ghosts, keeping to the shadows, and the spaces between buildings where the rain fell hardest and vision was poorest. The streets were mostly empty, the downpour having driven sensible people indoors. Chaza's hip throbbed with each step, the old wound protesting the abuse he was putting it through. But he did not allow himself to limp or slow. Miriam stayed close beside him, one hand gripping his arm for support when her injured ankle threatened to buckle. The chain dragged behind her, leaving a furrow in the mud that anyone with half an eye could follow. They needed to get it off soon. Dr. Aidan Burns' house was a narrow clapboard building wedged between a Chinese laundry and a boarding house, whose second floor served as an unofficial brothel. The windows were shuttered against the storm and the door firmly closed. Chaza knocked twice, then waited. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, the sound barely audible over the rain drumming on the roof. The door opened a crack. A gray-haired man with wire-rimmed spectacles peered out, his face lined with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. "I don't treat Indians," he said flatly, his Irish accent thick. "And I don't treat trouble. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." "She's white," Chaza said, stepping aside so Byrne could see Miriam clearly. "She needs help." Byrne's eyes widened as he took in the torn dress, the chain, the bruises mottling her face, and visible arms, the blood. His face went pale beneath its weathering. "Blast it all to hell," he muttered. He glanced up and down the alley quickly, then opened the door wider. "Get inside. Quickly now, before someone sees you." The room beyond was small and cluttered with the tools of a frontier doctor's trade, surgical instruments, laid out on stained cloth, bottles of tincture and carbolic acid lined up on rough shelves, stacks of old newspapers yellowed with age serving as kindling for the small stove in the corner. The smell was a mixture of ether, whiskey, tobacco, and beneath it all the faint copper tang of old blood that never quite washed out of the floorboards. Byrne cleared a space on his examination table with one sweep of his arm, sending a pile of bandages to the floor. "Sit," he ordered Miriam. She climbed onto the table with Chaza's help, her legs shaking so badly she nearly collapsed. Chaza stood by the single window, watching the street through a gap in the shutters for any sign of pursuit. Behind him, he could hear Byrne examining the manacle, muttering to himself in a mixture of English and Gaelic. "Logging chain?" Byrne said after a moment. "Heavy duty, built to hold tons. I'll need to file through one of the links. It'll take time, and it won't be pleasant for you, lass." He looked at Miriam with something like pity in his tired eyes. "The metal will heat up from the friction. It'll burn your wrist. I can give you whiskey for the pain, but that's all I have." "No whiskey," Miriam said, her voice firmer than it had been. "I need to stay clear-headed. Just do it." Byrne nodded and fetched a metal file and a bottle of carbolic acid from his shelf. "This will hurt," he warned her. "The acid I'll use after to clean the wounds will sting like hellfire itself." "I understand," Miriam said. She gripped the edge of the table with her free hand, knuckles going white. Byrne began to file. The rasp of metal on metal filled the small room, a slow grinding rhythm that seemed to go on forever. Miriam's face went tight with pain as the metal heated the chain, conducting the friction burn directly to her already raw wrist. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Her breathing became shallow and controlled, each breath measured and deliberate. But she did not cry out. She did not make a sound beyond the occasional hiss through clenched teeth. Chaza found himself moving closer without conscious thought. He placed his hand over hers where it gripped the table edge. She looked up at him, surprise flickering in her pain-dilated eyes. Then her fingers uncurled and wrapped around his wrist, instead holding on with desperate strength as Byrne continued his work. Their breathing synced without either of them realizing it. Slow inhale, controlled exhale, finding a rhythm that made the pain bearable. After what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, the link finally snapped with a sharp metallic ping. The chain fell away, 3 feet of it clattering to the floor. Miriam sagged with relief, her grip on Chaza's wrist loosening but not releasing. Byrne poured carbolic acid over the raw flesh of her wrist, and this time she did cry out, a short, sharp sound of pure agony, quickly bitten off. He worked quickly after that, cleaning the wounds with practiced efficiency and wrapping her wrist in strips of clean linen. When he finished, Byrne set down his instruments and looked at Chaza with an expression that mixed admiration and concern. You know they'll come for you. Malloy doesn't let his property walk away, and he has the law on his side, corrupt as it is. I know, Chaza said. Byrne hesitated, then seemed to come to some internal decision. He reached into a drawer of his desk and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. I sent a telegram last week to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne about missing women. 3 have vanished from this town in the last 6 months, all of them arriving on the stagecoach answering marriage advertisements. I suspected Malloy and Hale were running some kind of scheme, but I had no proof, no evidence beyond the rumors and my own gut feeling. He handed the paper to Chaza. Malloy intercepted it at the telegraph office, said he needed to review it before it went out to make sure there were no misunderstandings. It never went any farther than his desk. Chaza unfolded the paper carefully. The message was brief and written in a careful hand. Request immediate investigation into disappearances of women arriving as mail-order brides. Suspect trafficking ring. Town of Broken Wheel. Urgent response required. Dr. A. Byrne. This is evidence, Chaza said, folding the paper and tucking it carefully into his shirt against his chest where it would stay dry. It's worthless if Malloy's still breathing and controlling the telegraph, Byrne replied. And if you're both dead. He looked at Miriam with genuine concern. I'm sorry, lass. I should have done more. Should have found a way to get word out earlier. You did what you could. Miriam said, her voice steadier now, despite the pain that still showed in the tightness around her eyes. Thank you for helping us now. Byrne waved off her thanks. Just don't die, either of you. I've got enough ghosts on my conscience without adding 2 more. He paused, then added, if you make it out alive, find a way to get word to Marshal Carson in Cheyenne. Tell him Byrne said to check the bank records. Laurent's bank, that's where the real evidence will be. Laurent, Chaza asked, filing the name away. Banker, Byrne said. Came to town about 4 years ago with money and credentials that seemed legitimate enough. Bought out the previous bank owner and has been expanding his interests ever since. He and Malloy are thick as thieves, literally, I suspect. If there's a trafficking operation, Laurent's likely financing it and using the bank to hide the proceeds through false entries. This was new information and important. Chaza committed it to memory. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, Byrne replied. Just survive long enough to bring these bastards down. They slipped out the back door into the rain, which had lessened slightly to a steady drizzle. Chaza led Miriam west toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie and scrub. Behind them, voices rose Crow's posse, spreading out to search, going door to door now with increasing desperation. They had maybe an hour before the net tightened completely. They needed allies. They needed evidence. And they needed to move fast before Malloy and his men cut off all their options. Chaza knew where to start. The schoolteacher, Margaret Pike, lived in a small cabin on the north edge of town next to the one-room schoolhouse where she taught the children of farmers and shopkeepers. She was known for her sharp tongue and her refusal to bow to pressure from the town council when they tried to dictate what she could and could not teach. 2 years ago, she had secretly taught reading to Lakota children from the camps until the council discovered it and threatened to dismiss her. She had stopped the lessons under pressure, but Chaza remembered the defiance in her eyes when she had apologized to the parents. She was not afraid of Malloy, or at least she hid her fear better than most. They approached her cabin from the back, moving through a stand of cottonwood trees whose leaves rustled in the wind. Chaza knocked on the rear door, 3 quick taps, followed by 2 slow ones, a pattern he had seen her use once to signal her brother when she wanted privacy. The door opened almost immediately. Margaret Pike stood framed in the lamplight, tall and spare with graying brown hair, pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a simple dress and held a cast-iron skillet in one hand like a weapon. When she saw Chaza, her eyes widened. When she saw Miriam behind him, the torn dress, the bandaged wrist, the exhaustion, her expression hardened into something fierce and determined. "Inside," she said simply. "Now." They crowded into her small kitchen. Margaret shut the door and drew the curtains before turning to face them. "You're the talk of the town," she said without preamble. "Crow's telling everyone you kidnapped a woman from Hale's barn. Says there's $100 reward, 50 for you alive, 50 more if they kill you resisting arrest. Half the men in town are out looking, hoping for easy money." "It's a lie," Miriam said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "They chained me. They beat me. They forged marriage documents using handwriting samples they forced me to practice. Sheriff Malloy claims I'm his legal wife, but I never consented to anything." Margaret's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Malloy." She spat the name like a curse. "That man is a cancer on this town. But he's a well-protected cancer. The territorial governor appointed him personally, and he's got connections in Cheyenne that go right up to the Capitol building. We need to prove what he's doing," Chaza said. "We need evidence that will stand up even against his connections." Dr. Byrne mentioned a ledger. "In Hale's barn," Margaret finished. "I've heard rumors about it. Supposedly Hale keeps records of all his transactions, legitimate and otherwise. If such a ledger exists and documents the women who've disappeared, it would be damning evidence." "We need to get it," Chaza said. "And we need someone who can testify to what's in it." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then she nodded slowly. "There's a man named Virgil who runs a farm north of here. He's helped me in the past when I needed supplies smuggled in for my unofficial students. He owes me a favor, and he's got no love for Malloy after the sheriff seized part of his land last year on some trumped-up tax assessment. I can send my brother to fetch him with his mule cart. You can hide in my woodshed until dark, then we'll plan your next move." "What about you?" Miriam asked. "If Malloy finds out you helped us, let me worry about my own skin," Margaret said firmly. "I didn't become a teacher on the frontier because I was afraid of powerful men. Now sit down before you fall down. You both look like death warmed over." She fed them bread and cold chicken water that tasted clean and pure after days of drinking from muddy streams. As they ate, Margaret's brother, a lean young man, of perhaps 20 with their mother's sharp features, slipped out into the growing dusk to find Virgil. Chaza and Miriam moved to the woodshed, a cramped space that smelled of sawdust and pine resin. They sat side by side on a pile of split logs, exhaustion finally catching up with them, now that they had a moment of relative safety. "Thank you," Miriam said quietly, "for everything. You didn't have to do any of this. You could have walked away, bought your horse, gone home to your people." "I couldn't," Chaza said simply. "Why?" She turned to look at him in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the shed walls. "Why risk everything for a stranger?" He was silent for a long moment, deciding how much to tell her. Then he said, "My mother was taken once when I was 8 years old. White traders came to our camp while most of the men were out hunting. They wanted women for—" He stopped his throat tight. "My father and the other warriors tracked them for 2 days and got her back. But I saw what it did to her afterward. The fear that never quite left her eyes. The shame she carried even though she had done nothing wrong. She taught me that when you see someone in chains, real chains, or the invisible kind, you do something about it if you can. Otherwise, you become part of the chain yourself." Miriam was quiet, absorbing this. Then she said, "I'm sorry that happened to her. To you." "It made me who I am," Chaza said. taught me that some things matter more than safety or convenience. He looked at her directly. You matter, Miriam Cole. What they did to you matters. And I'm not walking away until we make it right. She felt something shift inside her chest, some tight knot of fear and isolation beginning to loosen. She leaned her head against his shoulder, tentative and ready to pull back if he stiffened. He didn't. Instead, he sat very still, letting her rest, and after a moment, his hand found hers in the space between them. Their fingers interlaced, and they sat like that in the growing darkness, drawing strength from the simple fact of not being alone. Outside, the sound of dogs baying in the distance drifted on the wind. Crow had bloodhounds now. The hunt was intensifying. Night fell hard and fast, the storm clouds blocking any hint of moon or starlight. Chaza and Miriam huddled in the woodshed, listening to the sounds of the town beyond, horses moving in the streets, men calling to each other, the baying of the tracking dogs growing closer, then fading away again as the search pattern widened and shifted. Margaret's brother returned near midnight, with Virgil, a weathered farmer in his 60s, with hands like gnarled tree roots and eyes that had seen too much hardship to be easily impressed. He looked at Chaza and Miriam for a long moment, taking their measure, then nodded once. Margaret says you need help getting out of town, he said without preamble. I've got a cart and a team that can move quiet when needed. But first, Margaret says you need to get into Hale's barn and retrieve some kind of record book. That right? Yes, Chaza said. A ledger. It will have names, dates, payments. Proof of what Malloy's been doing. And then, Virgil asked. Then we need someone to confess. Hale would be the obvious choice. He keeps the records, he handles the physical side of the operation. If we can make him talk, he won't. Virgil interrupted. Not willingly. Hale's a weasel, but he's a scared weasel. He'll die before he crosses Malloy openly. Then we find a way to make it worth his while, Miriam said. Her voice was steady now, determination replacing the earlier fear. Or we make him more afraid of us than he is of Malloy. Chaza looked at her with new respect. The woman who had been huddled in that stall, broken and resigned, was disappearing. In her place was someone harder, someone who had decided to fight back. The barn will be watched, Margaret's brother said. He was introduced as Daniel, and he spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent time as a scout. Crow's got men posted at the front, but there's a loose board in the back wall near the grain storage. I've used it before when I needed to borrow a horse for, shall we say, unofficial purposes. Can you show us? Chaza asked. Daniel nodded. We go in 2 hours when the saloons are at their fullest and the night watch is at its drunkest. Crow's men drink on duty. They'll be less sharp after midnight. What about the ledger? Miriam asked. Where would Hale keep it? His office is a small room off the main barn, Daniel said. He keeps it locked, but the lock is nothing special. A good knife will pop it. And Hale himself? Chaza asked. Lives above the barn in a small apartment. He'll be there probably drinking himself to sleep like he does most nights. Margaret spoke up from where she stood in the doorway. There's more you need to know. Dr. Byrne told you to check the bank records at Laurent's bank. That's not random advice. Laurent is not just Malloy's partner, he's the architect of the whole operation. Malloy provides the muscle and the legal cover. Hale provides the arrangements. But Laurent provides the financing, the connections to the stage lines, and telegraph offices, and the concealing of proceeds in the bank's books through legitimate business transactions. This confirmed what Byrne had hinted at, but hearing it stated so directly gave it new weight. So, Malloy is just the enforcer, Chaza said slowly, working through the implications. Laurent is the real power. Exactly. Margaret said. Which means getting Hale to confess to Malloy's involvement won't be enough. You need evidence that ties Laurent to the operation. Otherwise, he'll sacrifice Malloy, claim ignorance, and continue the operation under someone else's protection. Where would that evidence be? Miriam asked. In the bank, Margaret said. Laurent keeps everything documented. He's meticulous about records because he uses them to control people. There will be a safe in his office with the real books, the ones that show where the money actually comes from and where it goes. Chaza felt the plan crystallizing in his mind. We need to hit both locations in the same night. The barn for the ledger and Hale's confession, the bank for Laurent's records. That's ambitious, Virgil said dryly. Some might say suicidal. Some might be right, Chaza acknowledged. But we won't get another chance. Once Malloy realizes we're after evidence, he'll destroy everything. We do this tonight, or we don't do it at all. Miriam straightened, wincing as her injured ankle protested. I'm going with you. You're hurt. Chaza started to object. I'm hurt but functional, she cut him off. And I'm going. This is my fight as much as yours. More, maybe. I won't sit in a woodshed while you risk your life for my freedom. Chaza looked at her for a long moment, seeing the steel in her eyes. He nodded slowly. All right. But you follow my lead. No arguments. No arguments, she agreed. Margaret looked between them and shook her head. You're both insane. But you're the right kind of insane, I think. She moved to a cabinet and pulled out 2 items, a small revolver and a leather satchel. She handed the gun to Miriam. Do you know how to use this? No, Miriam admitted. Then you'll learn quickly. It's a Colt pocket model. 5 shots. Point it at whatever you want to stop existing and pull the trigger. The kick will surprise you the first time, so brace your wrist. Miriam took the weapon gingerly, feeling its weight. She had never held a gun before, never imagined she would need to. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world to curl her fingers around the grip. Margaret handed the satchel to Chaza. For carrying whatever you find, it's got a waterproof lining. Thank you, Chaza said. Don't thank me yet, Margaret replied. Thank me if you survive the night. They waited until the church bell tolled 2 in the morning. The rain had stopped, leaving the night clear and cold, with a sliver of moon providing just enough light to see by. Daniel led them through the back alleys of Broken Wheel, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every shadow and shortcut. They reached the rear of Hale's barn without incident. The loose board Daniel had mentioned was exactly where he said it would be. Chaza pried it open carefully, wincing at each creak of old wood. The gap was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. He went first, sliding through sideways, then reached back to help Miriam. Daniel stayed outside to watch for patrols. Inside the barn was dark and smelled of horses and old hay. Chaza oriented himself quickly, identifying the office Daniel had described, a small enclosed space, with a door and a window overlooking the main barn floor. Light showed beneath the door. Someone was still awake. They moved silently through the shadows, keeping to the edges where the darkness was deepest. Chaza could hear voices now, 2 men talking in low tones. One was definitely Hale, the whining quality of his voice, unmistakable. The other took him a moment to place. Then he recognized it, Deputy Crow. Don't like it, Hale was saying. That Indian's made us all look like fools. Malloy's furious. He's talking about burning the whole countryside to flush them out. Let him burn? Crow replied, his voice thick with something that might have been anticipation. I want that Indian alive. I want to take my time with him. Show him what happens to his kind when they interfere with white man's business. And the woman, She goes back to Malloy, though I doubt there'll be much left of her worth having after what he does to teach her a lesson. Chaza felt Miriam tense beside him, her breathing quickening with anger. He put a hand on her arm, steadying her, reminding her silently to stay calm and focused. They needed to wait for the right moment. "What about Laurent?" Hail asked, and Chaza's attention sharpened. "He's getting nervous. Says this is drawing too much attention. Wants to shut down operations for a while." "Laurent can go to hell," Crow said dismissively. "He sits in his comfortable bank counting money while we do the dirty work. He doesn't get to make demands." "He does when he's the one paying us," Hale pointed out. "Without his financing and his connections, we're just thugs beating up women. He's the one who turned it into a profitable business. Then he should trust us to handle problems when they arise," Crow said. "Now pour me another drink and stop whining. We'll find them tomorrow. Can't hide forever out there on the prairie." There was the sound of liquid being poured, glasses clinking. Then Crow said, "I need to check on the night watch. Make sure they're actually watching instead of sleeping. You stay here, keep the light on. Anyone comes around, you come find me immediately. Understand?" "Yes," Hale said quickly. Footsteps approached the door. Chaza and Miriam pressed back into the shadows of an empty stall, hardly breathing. The door opened, light spilling out, and Crow emerged. He stood for a moment, adjusting his gun belt, then walked toward the front of the barn and out into the night. The moment he was gone, Chaza moved. He crossed the space to the office door in 3 quick strides and pushed it open. Hale was sitting at a small desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and he looked up in shock as Chaza entered. "Hello, Vernon," Chaza said quietly. "We need to talk." Hale's mouth opened to yell. Miriam was suddenly there beside Chaza, the small revolver pointed steadily at Hale's chest. "Make a sound, and I'll shoot you," she said, her voice absolutely calm and cold. "I've been looking forward to it, actually." Hale's mouth snapped shut. He raised his hand slowly, the whiskey glass forgotten. "The ledger," Chaza said. "Where is it?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Hale started. Miriam cocked the hammer on the revolver with an audible click. "Wrong answer. Try again." Hale's face went pale. His eyes darted to a cabinet in the corner. "Bottom drawer," he said quickly. "Locked. Keys in my vest pocket." Chaza retrieved the key and opened the drawer. Inside was a green-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat handwriting. He flipped it open, scanning the entries. Names, dates, payments, notations about shipments and deliveries. It was all there exactly as they had hoped. He tucked it into the satchel Margaret had given him. "Now you're going to write a confession," Chaza said. "Everything, how the operation works, how many women, what happened to them, who's involved, Laurent, Malloy, Crow, everyone." "I can't," Hale said, his voice breaking. "Laurent will kill me. He's got connections everywhere. Even if I run, he'll find me." "Then you have a choice," Miriam said, her voice still that same cold calm. "Confess and take your chances with Laurent finding you eventually, or refuse and I shoot you right now. Which would you prefer?" Hale stared at her, seeing something in her eyes that convinced him she meant every word. His shoulders sagged. "Give me paper," he said. Chaza found paper and a pen on the desk. Hale began to write, his hand shaking, but his writing legible. As he wrote, he talked, the words spilling out as if a dam had broken. Laurent started it 4 years ago. He had connections with stage line operators in 3 territories. They'd identify women traveling alone, women answering marriage advertisements or looking for work. He'd set up fake correspondences, fake job offers, fake marriage proposals. When the women arrived, Malloy and his deputies would intercept them, take their papers and money. We'd hold them in the barn or at other locations until they signed whatever documents Laurent needed. Marriage certificates, contracts, promissory notes. If they refused, we'd beat them until they complied, or send them north to the mining camps where no one asks questions. How many? Chaza asked, his voice tight. I don't know. Dozens. Maybe 50 or 60 over 4 years. Some we kept and married off to men who paid Laurent for the service. Others we sold to brothels or work camps. A few died. Hale's voice dropped to a whisper. A few killed themselves. Miriam made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Her hand shook on the revolver. Keep writing, Chaza said harshly. All of it, every detail. Hale wrote for 15 minutes, covering 3 pages in his cramped handwriting. When he finished, Chaza took the pages and read them carefully. It was all their names, places, methods, profits. A complete confession that implicated everyone involved. Now sign it, Chaza said. Hale signed with a flourish, as if signing away his life, which, in a sense, he was. What are you going to do with me? He asked. Leave you here, Chaza said. Tied up. When Crow comes back, he'll find you. What you tell him is your business. They bound Hale to his chair with rope from the barn and gagged him with a strip of cloth. As they were finishing, they heard voices outside Crow returning with the night watch. They had run out of time. Chaza and Miriam slipped out through the back way they had entered. Daniel was gone, probably driven off by the approaching patrol. They ran through the darkness, the satchel heavy with evidence, against Chaza's side, heading for the one place they had not yet touched, Laurent's bank. The bank sat in the center of town, a 2-story brick building that radiated solidity and respectability. Getting inside would be nearly impossible with the town on alert. But they had to try. Without evidence tying Laurent to the operation, the banker would simply throw Malloy to the wolves and continue his schemes under new management. They circled to the back of the building where a narrow alley provided some cover. There was a window on the 2nd floor, Laurent's private office, if Daniel's information was correct. The window was dark. I can climb, Miriam whispered. I used to climb trees as a girl. I'm lighter than you. Chaza hesitated, then nodded. She was right, she was lighter, and would make less noise. He boosted her up, and she found handholds in the brick, climbing with surprising agility despite her injured ankle. She reached the window and tested it carefully. It was locked, but old. She used the barrel of the revolver to break the glass as quietly as possible, then reached through to unlatch it from inside. She disappeared through the window. Chaza waited below, every nerve on edge, listening for any sound of alarm. Minutes crawled by like hours. Then Miriam's face appeared at the window. She lowered a rope where she had found it, he couldn't guess, and he climbed up to join her. Laurent's office was exactly what one would expect of a successful frontier banker. Solid furniture, expensive carpet, a large safe in the corner. Miriam pointed to the safe. It was closed and locked with a combination dial. Chaza examined it. Can't force it, he whispered. Too thick. Then we find the combination, Miriam whispered back. She began searching the desk, moving papers carefully, looking for anything that might give them a clue. Chaza joined her, working methodically through drawers and files. In the bottom drawer of the desk, hidden beneath a false bottom, they found a second ledger, thicker than Hale's, bound in red leather. Chaza opened it, and even in the dim light from the street lamps outside, he could see that this was what they needed. Financial records, payments to Malloy, Hale, Crow, and others, receipts from stage line operators, bills of sale for women described only as domestic assets, a complete paper trail connecting Laurent to every aspect of the trafficking operation. Got it, he breathed. A sound from downstairs froze them both. Then the front door, opening footsteps on the wooden floor. Someone was in the building. They moved quickly and silently to the window. Chaza went first, sliding down the rope, then catching Miriam as she followed. They ran through the alley just as a light came on in Laurent's office above. Behind them, a shout of alarm. They had been discovered. They ran through the darkness, heading north out of town toward where Virgil was supposed to be waiting with his cart. Behind them, the town erupted, bells ringing, men shouting, the sound of horses being saddled in a rush. The hunt was on in earnest now. Virgil was where he had promised to be, his cart hidden in a grove of cottonwoods a mile north of town. They threw themselves into the back of the cart, gasping for breath. Virgil took one look at them, at the satchel Chaza clutched, and nodded grimly. "Hold on," he said, and snapped the reins. The mules lurched into motion, pulling the cart north through the darkness at a dangerous pace. Behind them, the sky above Broken Wheel was lit with torches as Malloy's entire force mobilized. They had perhaps an hour's head start, maybe less. "Where are we going?" Miriam asked, her voice shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. "Stonebridge," Virgil said. "Only crossing over the White River for 50 miles in either direction. If we can get across before they catch us, we might have a chance. There's a marshal station in Willow Creek on the other side. If we can reach it..." "They'll cut us off at the bridge," Chaza said, already seeing the tactical problem. "Malloy knows that's the only crossing. He'll send men ahead to block it." "Probably," Virgil agreed. "But what choice do we have? We can't outrun them on open ground, and we can't hide with those dogs tracking us." He was right. They were committed now. Forward to the bridge or die running. The cart bounced and jolted over the rough trail, moving as fast as the mules could pull. Chaza checked the revolvers, his own and the one Margaret had given Miriam. Between them, they had 11 shots. Not nearly enough if it came to a pitched battle. Dawn was breaking in the east, pale gray light spreading across the prairie when they crested a rise and saw Stonebridge ahead. It was exactly as Virgil had described, a timber span 60 feet long, suspended 20 feet above the churning waters of the White River. The spring runoff had swollen the river to a torrent brown water, thick with mud and debris tearing at the bridge pilings, and blocking the near end of the bridge were 6 mounted men. At their center, sitting tall in the saddle on a black horse, was Sheriff Samuel Malloy. Virgil pulled the cart to a stop 100 yards from the bridge. "End of the line," he said quietly. Malloy walked his horse forward, slowly stopping halfway between his men and the cart. He was a tall man in his late 40s, with iron-gray hair and a face that might have been handsome once, before cruelty and cynicism carved it into harsh planes. The scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw gave him a permanent sneer. But it was his eyes that drew attention, pale gray eyes that looked at the world with absolute certainty in his own superiority. "Well now," Malloy said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "This has been quite the chase. I'd have thought you'd be halfway to the Black Hills by now, Indian. But instead here you are at my bridge with my property and my documents. That was foolish of you." "She's not your property," Chaza called back. "And these documents prove it." Malloy smiled, a cold expression that never touched his eyes. "Documents can be disputed. Ledgers can be claimed as forgeries. My word against yours, and I'm a duly appointed territorial sheriff, while you're a savage who kidnapped a white woman. Which of us do you think the law will believe?" "Maybe the territorial marshal will believe the evidence," Miriam called out, her voice strong despite her fear. "Maybe he'll wonder why a respected banker like Laurent has records of buying and selling women like cattle." Something flickered in Malloy's eyes, surprised perhaps that she knew about Laurent. "You've been busy," he said. "Breaking into private offices, stealing confidential documents. That's several crimes right there. Laurent will be very interested to know how you got into his safe." "We didn't need the safe," Chaza said. "The ledger was in his desk. He got careless." Malloy's smile faded slightly. "I see." He was quiet for a moment, clearly recalculating. Then he said, "Let me make you an offer. Give me the documents and the woman, and you can ride away. I'll even give you a horse. You have my word as an officer of the law." "Your word means nothing," Miriam said. "Everyone in Broken Wheel knows you're corrupt." "Corrupt is such an ugly word," Malloy said. "I prefer pragmatic. I saw an opportunity to profit from a situation that would have existed with or without me. Women have always been traded and bartered on this frontier. I simply made the process more efficient and profitable for all involved." "Except for the women," Chaza said. "They entered into legal contracts." Malloy replied with a shrug. "What happened after that was between them and their new owners. I'm simply a facilitator." "You're a slaver," Miriam said flatly, "and you're going to hang for it." Malloy's expression hardened. "Last chance. The documents. Now." "No," Chaza said. Malloy sighed as if genuinely disappointed. "I was afraid you'd say that." He raised his hand, and his men drew their weapons. What happened next happened fast. Chaza grabbed Miriam and pulled her behind the cart as bullets tore through the wooden sides. Virgil cried out and fell clutching his shoulder where a bullet had struck. The mules bolted in panic, dragging the cart forward in a wild, uncontrolled rush directly toward Malloy and his men. Chaza and Miriam clung to the lurching cart, barely staying aboard. One of Malloy's men tried to grab the mule's harness and was knocked aside by the careening cart. Another fired and missed as the cart swerved. Then they were past Malloy's line and onto the bridge itself. The timbers groaned under the sudden weight of the cart and mules. Chaza hauled himself up and grabbed the reins, trying to slow the panicked animals. Behind them, Malloy and his men wheeled their horses and charged onto the bridge in pursuit. Halfway across, a support timber cracked with a sound like a gunshot. The entire bridge bucked and tilted. Chaza felt the cart sliding sideways toward the rail. He grabbed Miriam, pulling her close. "Jump!" They leapt from the cart just as it hit the rail and shattered. The mules went over the side, their screams cutting off abruptly as they hit the water and were swept away. Virgil, still in what remained of the cart, managed to grab a support beam as the wreckage tumbled over the edge, hanging on with his good arm. Malloy and his men pulled their horses to a plunging stop as the bridge continued to sway and groan. The horses screamed, eyes rolling in terror. Two of the deputies dismounted immediately and ran for the near end. But Malloy stayed mounted, his face twisted with rage. Crow appeared behind him, having ridden hard to catch up. "Off the horses!" Crow shouted. "The bridge won't hold them." Malloy dismounted reluctantly, as did the remaining men. They advanced on foot now, spreading out across the width of the bridge. Chaza and Miriam had nowhere to go. Ahead was the far side, but they'd never make it before being shot. Behind was Malloy's line. Below was the churning river. Chaza pulled Miriam behind the wreckage of the cart, which had lodged against the rail. It wasn't much cover, but it was something. He drew his revolver. 6 shots. Miriam had 5 in hers. 11 bullets against 6 men. "Aim carefully," he told her. "Make every shot count." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Malloy and his men advanced, slowly spread out, so they couldn't all be targeted at once. Crow was on the left, his rifle already raised. 2 deputies on the right. Malloy in the center with 2 more men flanking him. Chaza fired first, aiming at the deputy on the far right. The man went down with a scream, clutching his leg. Miriam fired at the same time, her shot going wide, but forcing the men to duck. 10 shots left. Crow laughed that ugly sound, carrying over the roar of the water. "You can't win this, Indian. Give up, and maybe we'll make it quick." "I've got a better idea," Crow shouted to Malloy. "The bridge is already compromised. A few shots in the right places and it'll come down. Let the river take them and the evidence both." Malloy smiled. "Do it." Crow aimed his rifle at a support joint where the beams met the main span and fired. The timber splintered, splinters flying. The bridge lurched sickeningly to one side. He aimed at another joint. Chaza fired and Crow jerked back his shot, going wild. Blood bloomed on Crow's shoulder, but he didn't drop. 9 shots left. "You'll have to do better than that," Crow snarled. He fired again, this time hitting the support. The timber gave way with a crack like thunder. The entire center section of the bridge tilted at a crazy angle. Chaza and Miriam slid toward the gap, grabbing desperately at the wreckage. On the other side of the tilted section, Malloy and his men struggled to keep their footing. "Miriam," Chaza said urgently, "the support beams. If we shoot out enough of them on their side, the bridge will collapse under them, not us." She understood immediately. "Which ones?" "The ones already cracked. They're—" He pointed to a joint that was splitting, held together by just a few intact fibers of wood. "And there." They fired together. Miriam's shot hit true and the beam shattered. Chaza's took out another. 7 shots left. The bridge section under Malloy and his men groaned and dropped several inches. One deputy lost his balance and tumbled over the rail, his scream swallowed by the river. "Back," Malloy shouted. "Get back to solid ground." His men scrambled backward, but the bridge was disintegrating beneath them. Another support gave way without anyone shooting it. The structure was simply failing under the stress. Crow, isolated on a section of decking that was separating from the main span, raised his rifle one more time. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." Miriam fired. The shot took Crow in the chest. He staggered, dropped his rifle, and toppled backward through a gap in the planking. The river took him instantly. 6 shots left between them, but now there was a gap of 10 feet between where Chaza and Miriam crouched and where Malloy stood with his 3 remaining men. The center section of the bridge had collapsed partially, leaving a chasm with rushing water visible below. "Looks like a stalemate," Malloy called across the gap. "You can't reach me and I can't reach you. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go back to town, destroy any remaining evidence, and tell everyone you died trying to escape. Laurent will back me up. Your bodies will never be found, and life will go on." "No," Miriam said. She stood holding the revolver steady despite the tilting deck. "You're not walking away from this." Malloy laughed. "What are you going to do? Shoot me from there? You'd need to be a marksman to make that shot, and you're just a scared little girl." "Maybe," Miriam said. "But I'm a scared little girl who's got nothing left to lose." She aimed carefully, bracing her wrist the way Margaret had taught her. She breathed out slowly, squeezed the trigger. The shot took Malloy in the right shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his gun with a curse of shock and pain. Chaza fired immediately, aiming not at Malloy, but at the support beam directly beneath him. The beam, already weakened, shattered. The section of bridge where Malloy stood dropped away completely. Malloy's eyes went wide. He scrabbled for purchase, but there was nothing to grab. He felt his scream echoing off the canyon walls and hit the water with a splash that was swallowed by the roar of the current. The brown water closed over him, and he was gone. The 2 remaining deputies threw down their weapons. "We surrender," one shouted. "Don't shoot." But they were on the far side of the collapsed section. There was no way to reach them, and no way for them to reach Chaza and Miriam. "Run!" Chaza shouted across to them. "Run back to town and tell Laurent we're coming for him. Tell him we have all the evidence. Tell him it's over." The deputies didn't need to be told twice. They turned and ran. Chaza and Miriam carefully made their way to the far side of the bridge, where the structure was still intact. Virgil had managed to pull himself up from where he'd been hanging, his face gray with pain, but alive. Together, the three of them limped across the remaining span and onto solid ground. They collapsed on the far bank, gasping, shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. The satchel with both ledgers and Hale's confession was still strapped across Chaza's chest, muddy but intact. "We did it," Miriam whispered. "We actually did it." "Not done yet," Chaza said. "We still need to get this to the marshal." "The marshal station is 2 miles up the road." Virgil said, his voice weak but determined. "I can make it if you help me." They walked together through the dawn light, leaving the ruins of Stone Bridge behind them. The river raged below, carrying away the wreckage and the bodies of those who had thought they were untouchable. Marshal Carson was at the station when they arrived, having just ridden in from Cheyenne in response to Burns' telegram that had finally gotten through via alternative channels. He took one look at them, bloodied, exhausted, but triumphant, and listened to their story. When they handed him the 2 ledgers and Hale's confession, his weathered face went hard. "This is enough," he said. "More than enough. Laurent, the stage line operators, the telegraph clerks, will round them all up." And they did. Over the next week, Carson's deputies swept through Broken Wheel, and beyond making arrests based on the evidence Chaza and Miriam had risked everything to obtain. Laurent was found trying to flee with 2 bags of gold and was arrested at gunpoint. Hale, freed from his bonds when Crow's remaining men returned to town, turned state's evidence in exchange for a reduced sentence. The network that had destroyed so many lives was dismantled piece by piece. 3 weeks later, after giving their testimonies and watching justice finally move forward, Chaza and Miriam stood on a hill overlooking where Stone Bridge had been. A new span was already under construction, this one to be operated as a public crossing rather than a tool of oppression. "What will you do now?" Chaza asked. Miriam was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I can't go back to Pennsylvania. That life is gone. But I don't know what comes next." "There's room by the fire at Ghost Creek," Chaza said carefully. "My people would welcome you. It's not an easy life, but it's honest. And you'd be safe." She turned to look at him, studying his face. In the past weeks, as they had testified and healed and slowly begun to breathe again, something had grown between them. It wasn't the desperate survival bond of their escape, but something quieter and deeper. Trust earned through shared ordeal, respect built on proven character, and underneath it all, the first tentative beginnings of something that might, with time and care, become love. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like to see Ghost Creek, to meet your people, to learn how to live in a way that isn't defined by fear." Chaza took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "It won't be easy. The winters are hard. There's hunger sometimes, and danger and prejudice from every side." "I know," she said. "But we'll face it together. That's what we do, isn't it? We face things together." He smiled a real smile that softened his face and made him look younger. "Yes, that's what we do." They stood there for a while longer, hand in hand, watching the river flow beneath where the bridge had been. The water that had nearly killed them now flowed free, no longer controlled by men who saw everything as something to be owned and exploited. Then they turned and walked north together, toward Ghost Creek and whatever future they would build toward healing and hope, and the possibility of a life chosen freely rather than imposed by force. Two people who had found each other in darkness and decided to walk toward the light together. They had fought their own battle and won. They had saved themselves. And that made all the difference.